In Rome, in the heart of the Vatican, there is an amazing object. Not a painting or an icon, but a true image of Jesus Christ. It is called the Veil of Veronica.
The Veronica was believed to be a piece of fabric that touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image.
Venerated for over 1,000 years, this was once the most prized relic in Christendom and an object of pilgrimage. But one man has a shocking revelation. He believes the object in the Vatican is a fake. And he knows because he's found the real one.
It was the first time for around 500 years that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ.
This is the story of Paul Bade's journey of discovery to find what had happened to the true face of God. The story begins at a dinner in Turin, when journalist and author Paul Bade meets German art history professor Heinrich Pfeiffer. Father Pfeiffer tells Paul an amazing tale that, if true, could rewrite history, be the most significant discovery in Christianity, and show how what was once one of the most venerated objects in the Vatican could be a fraud.
I raised my glass to him and thought he must have been crazy.
The story revolves around a famous relic, the Veil of Veronica, whose origins are immortalized in most churches as the so-called sixth station of the cross. The stations of the cross take us through Christ's last terrible journey to his execution.
Every church has these images that we call the stations of the cross, and that allows us to accompany Jesus as he makes his way from his condemnation to death by Pontius Pilate right up to the moment of crucifixion and his burial.
Along the way, Jesus is met by friends and supporters who share in his pain and suffering. One of them is said to be a woman known as Veronica.
A pious woman of Jerusalem saw Christ suffering and bleeding and sweating, and she took her sweat cloth, which was a cloth she was wearing around her head, and gave it to him to dry his face from blood and sweat.
But legend has it that when Christ hands the cloth back to her, miraculously, an image of his face has transferred to the material. But it is only a story. Veronica herself is not actually mentioned in the Bible.
The legend of Veronica is moving us because it is a legend of compassion and love and a miracle. And it allows us to have an image of Christ.
Whatever its actual origins, stories of a cloth bearing a miraculous image of Christ, not made by human hands, continue to circulate throughout the early Christian period. Somehow, this miraculous cloth, with its image of Christ, makes its way to Rome.
The first documented evidence of the Veronica being in Rome is from 705, when Pope John VII built a shrine for the Veronica.
By 1200, the Veronica is on permanent display in St. Peter's Basilica, and thousands of people flock to see it. This image becomes hugely important to the world of art. Until then, artists had no idea what Jesus actually looked like. There are no clues in the Gospels, so they depicted him in an idealistic or general way.
There are images of Jesus in the catacombs and elsewhere from the 2nd and 3rd centuries where Jesus just looks like a normal young Roman man, clean-shaven, a bit plump. You can only identify him by the fact that he's performing a miracle, and he's normally doing it in the way that a Roman god would do. So, for example, he's curing someone by touching them with a stick.
But when the Veronica appears, all that changes. Now, artists and worshippers can look at an actual image of a real face.
It was very visual, and especially in the Middle Ages, the visual side of the faith was tremendously important. Having this imprint of Christ's face was almost as good as having a photograph.
You had an idea how God, who became man, really looks. God was not an idea, it was a face. God got a face, a human face.
The same face is seen and copied by many of the great artists and appears in more and more works. It becomes the model for Jesus. The characteristics are always the same: the parted hair, the thin beard, the nose and mouth.
The Veronica was copied widely, and the simplified image of Christ's face was distributed across the world.
In fact, this image becomes so popular that a whole guild of specialist artists is created just to meet the demand.
From the middle of the 14th century, you get really clear evidence for people who are reproducing the Veronica and reproducing the holy images of Rome and selling those on as copies, but copies which bear the same spiritual authority and miracle-working power that the original did.
The Veronica proves to be not only a potent symbol, but also a great source of revenue as an object of pilgrimage.
The Veronica becomes a very important relic in Rome, that there's a chapel dedicated to it in St. Peter's. It soon becomes even the symbol of pilgrimage to Rome. So it becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Successive popes used the Veronica to increase their prestige and influence.
Innocent III is particularly interested in promoting the Veronica, in part to promote the city of Rome itself and to encourage the pilgrimage to Rome.
Pope Innocent III grants indulgences for those who pray before the Veronica and gives it its own feast day and even parades it around the city.
The highlight of the Holy Year was the showing of the Veronica, because this was the encounter with Christ on earth when we were still alive.
Eventually, the Veronica becomes big business. Numbers visiting Rome become so vast that the decision is made to tear down the old Basilica of St. Peter's and rebuild it.
One of the ways in which popes of the early Renaissance proclaimed their authority and created their legacy was through major building projects. And St. Peter's is a good example of a Renaissance pope crafting his legacy with an oversized building project.
Dominating the center of this new basilica is the altar, which, according to tradition, is built above the tomb of St. Peter.
And then around it, they have these 4 pillars where they place the relics which were so popular in the Middle Ages: the head of St. Andrew, the veil of Veronica, the Holy Lance, and also part of the true cross. And each of these relics, in a sense, being a cornerstone, a pillar of this new Basilica of St. Peter's, the heart of the church.
In other words, the Veronica has become one of the great pillars of the Catholic Church. But then Rome enters a dark period of disruption and violence, and everything changes. On May 6, 1527, Rome is looted and attacked, ironically by the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor.
The sack of Rome was a catastrophe for the Roman Church. For 1,000 years, Rome was a safe place. where all the patrons and the kings and the emperors who came to Rome left important donations at St. Peter.
500 men are slain in front of the altar, and many of the relics it had housed disappear.
According to the contemporary reports, the most important relics were given away in a pub, and drinking soldiers were drying their mouth with the veil of Veronica.
In time, the dust settles, and the new St. Peter's Basilica is finally completed and consecrated. But by then, something has obviously changed. Although the Vatican still claims to have the Veronica safe, it is no longer on public display. And on the rare occasions when it is shown, it seems to look different.
Suddenly, the Veronica was not a clear, shiny image anymore, but a dark cloth with some traces of blood.
It leads some to wonder if the original face of God has been lost.
So the big question is, what happened to the original Veronica, the beautiful Veronica, which was painted by the painters in the Middle Ages? It disappeared. And here we have the discovery of Father Pfeiffer.
At the dinner in Turin, Father Pfeiffer outlines his theory to Paul Bade, that the real face of God is no longer in the Vatican. Paul is skeptical, but Father Pfeiffer goes further, claiming he knows where the real Veronica is now. 120 miles away, in a small town called Monopello.
He said, yes, there's something quite unknown on a little remote hilltop in the Abruzzi Mountains. He said, how come the whole world doesn't know of it? He said, yeah, that's a mystery. And, you know, he made it even more mysterious. And so it was just completely unbelievable.
Paul dismisses the whole theory.
I thought it's a fine story, but that was it. I wasn't even curious about it.
But this chance meeting would prove to be a turning point in Paul's life. The veil of Veronica is believed to show an image of the true face of Jesus. In a meeting with German art history professor Father Heinrich Pfeiffer, Paul Bade is told that the veil held in the Vatican could be a fake. Skeptical, Paul tries to forget the whole theory. Some months later, while traveling with his daughter down the Adriatic coast, Paul finds himself near Monopello. And the church that Father Pfeiffer had claimed is the home to the real Veronica. The town of Monopello, nestled within the mountainous region of Abruzzo, is in a remote area, off the beaten track, and largely forgotten by the outside world. Walking into the church, Paul sees the image for the first time.
The church had a mass, and after the mass I got up there, and this image was just, I mean, he looked at me.
Paul is immediately struck by the eyes, the gaze of Christ on this transparent image.
Seeing somebody's face is really seeing the person. You know, looking into somebody's eyes, looking at their expression, we can learn so much about that person. We believe that God became man in Jesus Christ, and to be able to see that face as it existed in his humanity, it would be a wonderful link with the divine nature.
Paul notices that the material is so fine that in certain light, the image almost vanishes. only returning when illuminated by a flashlight.
It's constantly exposed. And you can walk nearby, you can walk around, you can take pictures from any direction, and you can see how the light from the many windows in the church go through it. You can put your hand behind it, you can see your hand. You can put a newspaper behind it, and you can read the newspapers because it is so thin and so fine. And when you get very close to it, you see that the image itself is translucent. You don't see any color.
Paul could gaze at the image forever, but he is pressed for time.
My daughter, she was very impatient. She said, let's get off, I'm hungry, let's have something to eat. So she dragged me away, but I had to look at it one more time. And then he looked at me as if somebody who would just be awakening.
Deeply affected, but not sure of what he's just seen, Paul can't bring himself to believe it's the real thing. Two years pass, and after working abroad as the Jerusalem correspondent for the German daily newspaper Die Welt, Paul returns to Rome. It is here that the Veronica appears in his life once again.
So, around the corner, I saw a little poster announcing, not a press conference, a lecture of a certain Pater Pfeiffer. So that's my Pater Pfeiffer. So I have to see him. I have to see him again. I have to see what he's going to tell me about the image.
Father Heinrich Pfeiffer is a German Jesuit scholar specializing in medieval religious art.
Father Pfeiffer is one of the leading art historians of the Christian world, a highly educated man and very important art historian.
During the course of the lecture, Father Pfeiffer reiterates his claim that the Montepello image is the veil of Veronica. During the talk, Paul is struck by the detail in the magnified close-ups.
And I thought, this is it. It must be, everything must be true. But these images, there's no comparison to it. I hadn't seen photos like this before.
Paul is determined to tell the world about these miraculous images and write a book. He will need a lot of evidence to win over skeptics. The first question is, how can there even be a face displayed in Montepello if there is already a veil of Veronica in the Vatican?
Every year on Passion Sunday at 5 p.m., you can see what today is venerated in St. Peter as the Veronica, because the canons of St. Peter's appear on the balcony and bless the faithful with the modern-day Veronica, which is in a huge, heavy silver frame. But you can't see a human face.
Drawing on all his Roman contacts, he tries to secure a meeting with the Vatican authorities. Eventually, in summer of 2004, he is granted an audience with Professor Arnold Nesselrat, director of the Vatican Museum. Keen to learn the Vatican's angle on the Montepello image, Paul meets with Professor Nesselrat. He eagerly shows him pictures of the Montepello face and questions the professor about what it could be. But Professor Nesselrat will not be drawn into the debate about the Montepello image.
He had heard something of it, and he had heard something of Pater Pfeiffer. And he was from the big front who had decided about Pater Pfeiffer that he's not to be taken serious.
Professor Nesselrat will neither lend any credence to the Montepello image nor let Paul see the Vatican's Veronica. When pressed to go and examine the image in Montepello for himself, the professor declines, claiming it is beyond his jurisdiction. The official channels have gotten him nowhere. He needs a different approach for his investigation. Paul Babe believes that the Veil of Veronica held by the Vatican is a fake, and that the true veil is in a church in Montepello. But he is denied permission to even look at the Vatican's veil. If he can't see the Vatican's image, he needs to find out more about the one in Montepello. When had it arrived? And how had it gotten there?
The problem with something like the image of Montepello is that there just isn't a paper trail, basically. So we know this object has been here in Montepello for a certain amount of time. We know that it arrived there under certain circumstances, but before that, who knows, basically. There's just no way of telling.
Paul realizes that if it is real, then the most likely time for its arrival in Montepello would have been around 1527, during the sack of Rome. And there seems to be a link. Paul's research shows that Pope Clement took refuge in the Castle Sant'Angelo after the sack of Rome. Something as valuable as the Veronica wouldn't have been left behind. While waiting for the looting to end, Paul thinks it's possible that the commander of the castle had it spirited away to safety, far from Rome. Intriguingly, the commander had an estate in Montepello. And it all seems to make sense.
One very realistic perspective is what Bade believes in, that the Castello Sant'Angeli, who had land in Montepello, safeguarded it and brought it there to protect it.
But confusingly, there is another version of events.
In 1506, a stranger appeared in Montepello and gave it to a local. And this local wanted to ask questions, but suddenly the stranger disappeared and he believed he was an angel.
This didn't add up, as 1506 is 21 years before the sack of Rome. Paul then looks at what was happening in Rome during this period and discovers that very little is written about the Veronica for 100 years after the sack of Rome, until the consecration of St. Peter's Basilica in 1626. Officially, the Veronica is still there, housed within one of the 4 famous pillars. But Paul discovers something puzzling. In 1629, Pope Urban VIII stopped the veil from being displayed. The lucrative trade in copies was prohibited, and he demanded all existing copies be destroyed on pain of excommunication. It was as if someone was trying to hide something.
It was important to recall all the images of the Veronica which has disappeared, and to wait until it disappears from the memory of pilgrims and Christian faithful.
Paul discovers that the story of an angel bringing the image to Montepello first appeared during the time the images were being destroyed. When the Montepello image was scrutinized, 12 townspeople came up with a story that their face of God was brought to them by an angel long before the sack of Rome. To Paul, now this story made sense. The villagers had used this tale to pretend their image couldn't possibly be the real Veronica, and by doing so had protected their image from destruction. Only after time had passed did the Vatican start showing the Veronica again. But it seemed different, and much darker.
The replacement was not a good or bad copy, but something completely different. You had to destroy the original images. and replace them by what you have. Later, the Vatican gave out new prints of the Veronica, which resembled what we have today. But this is a clear indication that the original relic disappeared and was exchanged.
The evidence for this can be found in art. Now, not only did it look completely different, so did the copies made by artists. It all seemed to suggest that the original had been lost. Paul is now certain the original can't be in the Vatican, and that at some point the image was exchanged and a new one put in its place. But to prove that, he needs more evidence. He looks at early descriptions of the veil. In the past, it was recorded as being almost transparent. Even the Protestant reformer Martin Luther said that it was like a translucent piece of linen, unlike the blackened image in the Vatican. The Montepello image fits that description. Paul's attempts to see the Vatican's Veronica continue to be denied. Thinking laterally, he decides to visit their vast treasury museum. He is looking for any evidence that would tie the Montepello image to Rome before 1527.
In the treasury of St. Peter's, there is a broken frame in which the Veronica was once kept. A frame that you could observe from both sides, just like in Montepello, and roughly the same dimensions.
For Paul, it is another clue. Only a transparent image that could be viewed from both sides would ever be displayed in this way.
To have a frame which is translucent only makes sense if you have a translucent cloth, like the veil of Montepello. The dimensions fit. And this is why we believe that the original Veronica, which was venerated in this frame, is what we today call the veil of Montepello.
If the true Veronica is still in the Vatican, why had this frame been smashed and the original cut away?
Taking all the information together which we have, there's no doubt about it. It must have been the sack of Rome.
Paul concluded it was the Montepello image that was torn from this smashed frame. The image even has a glass chip still embedded in it. For Paul, the evidence linking the Montepello image to the original Veronica is conclusive. He is certain that they are one and the same. This now begged the biggest question of all. Could this really be the face of God? And if so, how had it been created? After years of research, Paul Bade is convinced that the true veil of Veronica is not hidden away in the Vatican, but rather on display in a church in Montepello. But could this really be the face of God? Paul goes back to the original story and looks for clues. The problem is, Saint Veronica doesn't exist in the Bible.
One of the striking features of the Western version of the legend is the character of Veronica herself, a saint kind of created by clerical error, if you like. The name obviously derives from the Latin for the true icon, or Latin and Greek. The true image of Christ becomes the Vera Icone Veronica. You've invented a saint.
In other words, there never was a Veronica. Her name simply referred to the cloth itself.
The legend of Veronica was only one of many attempts to explain what we really have. But the name is revealing what we are talking about. Vera Iconia, the true image, was not the name of a woman, but the name of the image.
The implications of this are enormous. If Veronica did not exist, then the image could not have been created when she had wiped Jesus' face on the way to the crucifixion. So how did it get there? Paul examines the material itself and discovers how extraordinarily fine it is. It doesn't look like linen or even silk. What could it be? In his research, he came across an ancient fabric called byssus.
There are several types of byssus in antiquity, but the most precious one was created from the silk of a shell of a mussel. It's called pinna nobilis. It's a very large Mediterranean mussel, 90 centimeters. Large thing.
Divers harvested byssus by hand. It took thousands of threads to make the smallest piece of silk. And as a result, it was extremely valuable. Byssus was so precious, it had long been revered as a religious material. Critically, it is being used during the time of Christ.
It was the most precious fabric in the antique times. You find it in the graves of the pharaohs in Egypt. You find it in the cloth of the high priest, the ephod were made of byssus. In the curtain of the temple, byssus was mentioned. It's mostly translated in English, for instance, shining linen.
But is the Monopello image made of byssus? Continuing his research, Paul tracks down a woman in Sardinia, the last mussel silk cultivator. He flies her to Monopello to see the image for herself.
We brought her here to the image of the veil. She got onto her knees. She said, oh dear, that's byssus. That's mussel silk.
Byssus is far too valuable to be used as something to mop up sweat. So how might the image have gotten there? Paul goes back to the Bible to look for clues. After Jesus dies, he is taken down from the cross and laid in a tomb with the different cloths needed for his burial. A shroud to wrap the body and a veil to cover his face.
Everybody was expecting to do the final burial on Sunday morning. That's why the women returned to wash and clean and embalm the body. When they came, the body had disappeared. The tomb was empty. He was not there anymore, because he was not dead anymore. He had risen.
In John chapter 20, there's that wonderful description of Peter and John running to the empty tomb. They've just heard from the women that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and they go and investigate. The Gospels are very clear that when the disciples entered the empty tomb, there were various burial cloths lying around, not just the shroud, but amongst others, the cloth that was around the face of Christ.
Such a funeral veil would have been made of a fine, valuable material, like byssus. Could it have been that while wrapped around Jesus' head, it had miraculously taken on the image of his face?
The Church clearly believes in the supernatural. It clearly believes in the miraculous. It clearly believes that the divine can work in the world. So it's certainly open to the possibility of images made without human hands. It was the image of a Christ who is alive, rather than the image that we find on the Shroud of Turin, the image of a dead man.
For the early Christians, it must have been a revelation that not only the body of the suffering Christ was imprinted on the burial cloth, but we also have the face of the resurrected Christ on a veil. And of course, both relics were venerated and given from generation to generation.
So could the Montepello image have been made by a miraculous process? The Veil of Veronica, held for centuries by the Vatican, is believed to show the true face of God. But now, Paul Bade's research shows that the true veil might actually be at a small church in Montepello. If so, then how was the image created in the first place? And what does this mean for the Vatican? Skeptics have often claimed that the Montepello image must be just a painting. But Paul discovers this has an unusual quality. You cannot dye or paint on it.
Paul Bade verified it is indeed not ordinary silk, but shell silk which you cannot paint. There are some very small pigments by medieval painters who try to refresh or to intensify colors in some point, or maybe even try to put fur images against it to get the replica blessed by the original. We call it second-class relic or relic by touch. But Paul Bade verified it is not a human being.
For Paul, all the pieces supporting his belief in the truth behind the Montepello image are fitting into place. From the Bible, he discovers what the cloth itself was used for.
Rather than being the cloth used by that pious woman as Jesus carried the cross, that it was actually one of the burial cloths of our Lord.
From paintings, he sees how the same image had been revered in Rome throughout the Middle Ages.
If you compare the Volto Santo of Montepello with all the paintings we have of the Veronica in Rome, they are identical. They're identical even in details.
And from the broken frame, he can see how it had been saved after the sacking of Rome and sent to Montepello, where it had been quietly forgotten for nearly 500 years.
It's so evident. This is the veil. There's no doubt about, I mean, you could rip my skin off. I mean, this is it.
For Paul Bade, the story of Montepello's face of God is almost complete, and he can start writing up his theory. After completing his research, he sends all his evidence, along with photographs, to Pope John Paul II. Paul's work finds a wide audience. Not only is it seen by Pope John Paul, but also by Cardinal Ratzinger, the leading authority on Catholic doctrine and thought, who compliments Paul in his work. To this day, no pope has openly admitted that the Vatican Veronica ever disappeared, or that the barely visible face shown today is anything other than what had always been on display. But Paul has no doubt about what had really happened.
It was a trick. It was a trick from the 500 years ago, from these times of Machiavelli.
Paul is certain that this trick or hoax was deliberately perpetrated to maintain the illusion that the Vatican still had the real one. But if this had happened hundreds of years ago, why not admit it now?
I think there's no question that having the Veronica in your church, if you happen to be the Pope, would be an incredibly useful asset. You know, it's an item of incredible holiness and power. Everyone is awestruck by it. You're going to get a lot of people coming to see it, and it shores up your power, effectively, as leader of the church.
Paul thinks there may have been another reason why the hoax was perpetrated. The Veronica had earned the church a lot of money.
They did not come to see St. Peter. They did not even come to see the Pope, as they do today. They wanted to see the veil.
Pilgrims had to be shown something, and that's just what happened. What started as a small hoax was simply allowed to continue until it became widely believed.
It's easy to dismiss it as just a cynical cashing-in exercise, and I'm sure it was partly a cynical cashing-in exercise. But it was also a way of making that pilgrimage real. I mean, remember, the whole idea of pilgrimage, at least in theory, is to take part in the physicality of something holy.
But others are more sympathetic about why the Veronica might have been replaced.
First of all, I have to disagree with both Father Pfeiffer and my dear friend Paul Bade in the idea that the canons of St. Peter perpetrated a hoax, a pious forgery, a pious fraud. I do not believe it. I believe they were hysterically searching for something and just took the second best and believed it because they wanted to believe it, that this is the right Veronica.
On April 2nd, 2005, Pope John Paul II dies. He is succeeded by the man who had complimented Paul on his work, Cardinal Ratzinger, who becomes Pope Benedict XVI.
On the 1st of September 2006, Pope Benedict visited Manopello. Often he visited Italian shrines to venerate the relics or the local traditions. And there's that very evocative image of Pope Benedict just staring at the veil in Manopello. There's a real sense of an encounter, of encountering face to face with Christ. He was clearly very moved.
For Paul, this is the justification for all his hard work.
When he came to Manopello for the first Pope, then he prayed here in silence. He bowed, he bent his knee in front of it, and then for more than 8 minutes he's been in silent prayer in front of it. I mean, it was very, very moving.
It was the first time, for we believe around 500 years, that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ, of the resurrected Christ.
Pope Benedict's visit changes everything.
A week later, on St. Peter's Square, in the next audience, he said, if we want to know who God is, then we only have to look into the face of his Son, and there we see who God is and how God is.
Although not actually authenticating the image, Pope Benedict's personal visit gives credibility to those who believe that this is the true face of God.
He brought the image back into the world. That's what he did.
Paul and many of the faithful believe there is no doubt that this image is genuine. But there will always be skeptics. They want proper scientific evidence to show how the image got there and how old it is. The guardians at Manopello aren't against testing as long as it is non-invasive, so it doesn't damage the veil. They hope science will develop in the future, allowing for a more detailed examination, which they are sure will vindicate their claims. If this happens, then the veil of Veronica would become one of the most significant discoveries in Christian history.